strong. So I think professionally that says everything. And then personally, a couple of weeks ago, Anjan won the Fernir Life Achievement Award from the International Association for Empirical Aesthetics. And he spent 30 minutes, yes, again, it's not a surprise because of his super important work as founder of Neuroaesthetics. And he spent 30 minutes talking about 25 years of neuroaesthetics and empirical aesthetics, but only had one slide with pictures of all of his postdocs. And he kept talking about them. And their pictures became larger and larger. And I think this says volumes about the person that he is. And at this point, I was going to say, and now I wonder how his slides will be now, but apparently he is not having any slides, which also is interesting. So Anjan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
You're okay if I just put this down? Plug it. Okay, sorry. Because I want cards. No, I want cards. With cards here, that's all right. So I want to thank Yoed for that lovely introduction. One of the secrets of having really great trainees and postdocs is just to get out of their way, and they do the rest, as is very clear with Yoed and a number of postdocs that are here. And I want to thank Indre and the people here for organizing this and giving me this opportunity to talk. 463 steps. So exactly 2 weeks ago to the day, I climbed 463 steps at the Brunelleschi Duomo in Florence. And it was a thrill to be there and to be at this particular site as someone who's interested in both art and architecture, seeing the frescoes that Vasari painted on the inside of it, climbing these steps in between the inner and the outer dome, this engineering marvel that Brunelleschi created without an interior scaffold. And thinking about the fact that what an incredible achievement of imagination, but at the same time had to deeply contend with physics, with material sciences, with the frescoes, with chemistry, and then with the idea of what this space might convey, meaning had to contend with psychology and neuroscience and possibly biology. And so it's an example of how ways in which art and science might combine. And so with that, what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about ways in which, as I think about art and science or science and art, and then use that as a vehicle to talk about how when I started the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, how we thought about having an artist in residence and what form that should take without having a lot of precedence for doing this. So in thinking about art and science, there are two extremes, both of which I think are vapid, but it's worth putting it out there, which is that the arts and science are incommensurate. They're parallel worlds in which people inhabit, and never the twain shall meet. Or at the other extreme, that art and science are doing exactly the same thing. And I think that also doesn't make sense. And so if you set it up that way, the question is what's happening in between those extremes, and how might we explore what that liminal space is between those two poles. So when people, scientists here especially, think about creativity, often people think about the person, the process, or the product. So you think, is it a creative person? What's the process of creativity? Is this a creative product? I would add another P to this, which is thinking about purpose. So at a first pass, it's only a first pass, you might think that the purpose of scientists is to explain. And on the other hand, the purpose of artists are to express. Now, already I'm going to point out something, which is if, as a scientist, my job is to explain, and you have heard various talks that, and this is for the artists, that you will be used to scientists science-splaining who you are and what you do. So forgive me for that, because there's going to be a little bit of that here, but everything I say should be understood as provisional and points for discussion. And so if our job is to explain, and in the best version of that, we generate knowledge and perhaps generate understanding, artists express, ideally create an experience, and in its best version, create meaning. When we think about persons, here I think there are some similarities, at least predispositions for what drives people, the motivational states. I think in science and art, generally, I think in both domains, people tend to be open to experiences. People tend to be curious, and these they strike me as kind of wellsprings of creativity, both in the sciences and the arts. But the process is where I think things start to diverge a little bit. And I used to think that scientists were precise, that precision mattered. And I was dissuaded by some of the people in the artists in residence in my lab, dissuaded at least from the idea that artists are not precise. So, I'm sure we will talk about this, but Judith, for example, works with glass. You can't be anything but precise if you're working with glass. And so the way in which artists work with materials, I think, has a different kind of precision that is not to be denied or underestimated. But there is one thing we do, which is quantify things. We tend to be specific about the way in which numbers matter and how numbers become the vehicle by which we understand the world and by which we try to explain the world, which is how we try to predict the world. And I think that is something that is a little bit different. And so certainly the artists in residence in our lab have had to sit through some of the lab meetings with sort of arguments about statistical models and kind of inferences we can make. And it might be the case that artists, in addition to being precise, have a kind of method, and scientists are certainly not monolithic, and neither are artists, and perhaps we can have a conversation later, and as artists talk about what the process is, which might vary from person to person. When we get to product, what is it we are putting out in the world? I think there are also some interesting differences, which is that for us, we hope to put something out there that approximates what is true in the world and ideally that is replicable. And our greatest hope is that some other lab picks up what we did and tries to replicate it. I suspect it is not the case that most other artists hope someone else goes out and plagiarizes their work. But there is something interesting about when thinking about the product and how this relates to the person. And I would like to venture this idea that in both cases, and let me point out that there are no shortage of egos in science, and I suspect there are no shortage of egos in the arts. But there's a way in which I think, certainly for scientists, and in a particular way, perhaps for artists, that we fade in the background if we are successful. And what do I mean by that? The scientific method, I think, is one of humanity's greatest inventions. And part of the idea behind that is if we run an experiment, anybody else in the world should be able to run the same experiment, and if we're lucky, get the same result. And so what that means is over time, if we are successful, other people have done the same thing, and we as an individual contributing to that little piece of the world no longer matter. I think the temporal duration for what the product of science and the product of art might be very different. And, having, again, just been in Florence, what a thrill it was to see both Donatello's David and Michelangelo's David at the same time. Now, we were also at the Galileo Museum, and it was a real thrill to see the actual telescope with which Galileo saw the moons of Jupiter, and the idea that here is an object, an aesthetic object, in which there was an experience that happened for the first time. But Galileo's actual theories don't really matter. He basically got it wrong. He thought there were circles and not ellipses. And so there is a way in which when we do science that eventually we accept and we expect that our findings are going to be provisional, they're incremental, and will eventually fade in a way that I think Donatello's and Michelangelo's David did not fade. It was just as thrilling to see it now, as I suspect generations in the last 600 years have experienced. But there might also be a way, I think, in which the artist's persona fades into the background. And what do I mean by that? Which is that if an artist is tapping into their own experience, it can't be just that. There has to be something resonant for another person to experience so that they can tap into the same kind of emotion, the same kind of feeling that perhaps the artist was trying to convey. Ocean touched on a little bit of this idea of value transmission in his talk this morning. But the irony is that I think even though this product that artists produce is highly, highly individual, it only works if it doesn't stay individual, that it taps into something general. And so Picasso famously said, now it turns out a good friend of ours, so far as Marcus Nadal, has told me that this is completely apocryphal. So we're not going to ignore that for the time being. But Picasso famously said, after Lascaux, we have invented nothing. But I think there is a kind of truth to that, whether he said that or not. We don't know who painted those amazing images in Altamira and Lascaux. But there is a way in which whatever was being depicted is just as resonant. And I think there's, to use big words, there's a way in which you hope that something particular, the intimate, can still reach out into the infinite in a way that I think what artists are trying to do. And in a similar way, I think what scientists are trying to do with very, very particular observations that reaches out to some kind of general law, general principle. I'd like to spend a little time on this idea that is commonplace in creativity research about things that are creative, are novel, and useful. And at least raise the issue of, is useful itself useful? Is it a problematic notion in some ways? So when, well, you can look at either extreme. You can say knowledge for knowledge's sake and art for art's sake. And how do those play out? One of the things when, in the abstract, I made reference to C.P. Snow's famous lecture from the 1950s of the two cultures. One of the things he was concerned about is that scientists had very little sense of the social context in which they do their science. And this was, I think probably about 10 or 15 years after the Manhattan Project. And so there was this example of the way in which science and the fruits, the products of science, has the potential to do horrible things. And right now, I think one can think about climate change, one can think about what AI might do. And there's a similar way in which scientists sometimes feel that they should not be burdened with the social value of what they do. I think that is a mistake. On the other hand, it seems as though artists are tremendously burdened right now with the social value of what they should do. And, yesterday, for example, at the panel that Greg and Sunil and Emily talked about funding, the current climate, it seemed as though is very clear that usefulness is an ascendancy. And so here's some ways of thinking about it, right? So is art a vehicle for understanding? Is it science? That science is domain, but there's this whole notion of aesthetic cognitivism. We received funding from the Templeton Religion Trust around this idea of art as a vehicle for understanding. Art and health, complete ascendancy now. Is art good for health? Art as a vehicle for transcendence. Is this something that uplifts us in these times of distress? And then art as a vehicle for social justice. Is part of the point of art to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable? Later, Matt from the Mural Arts program will be talking, and we're hoping to collaborate with him. They have this part of the Mural Arts program, 2 miles directly behind. So 2 miles to my right is where I work at an elite, highly privileged institution. And 2 miles directly behind me is the epicenter of the opioid crisis in Philadelphia. And Matt and his group are trying to use art to uplift this dispossessed population in this city, and is representative of many major cities in the country. So I want to be very clear. I want art for understanding, great. Art for health, great. Art for transcendence, great. Art for social justice, great. And yet, is that too much of a burden? And does art, and this is a genuine question for the artists, and hopefully we will get into this in our conversation. How do you feel about art as a utility? Open question. So when when I started the center, the question of why have an artist in residence, right? We're supposed to be the kind of nerdy cognitive neuroscience program that Mike Gazzaniga says, yeah, this is great. And why have an artist in residence program? And in part, it is because if you are going to work in this domain, in aesthetics or creativity, that it would be foolish not to take advantage of people who know a lot about these domains but are not scientists. And in my lab, we've been fortunate enough that, similar to what Helmut said in his talk, that we get a lot of visitors. So we get artists come to talk to us, architects, interior designers, and it is always useful for us to hear perspectives of people who are not scientists, but who think deeply about these issues. And one of the things that people in my lab, ad nauseum, which is a mantra in my lab, is the question is the question. Until we really know what the question is we want to ask, there's no point in doing any kind of research. But it is also a truism that we don't know what we don't know. And so constraining the questions we ask to what we know seems foolishly narrow. And so that's part of the reason of wanting people from other disciplines embedded in our lab. And we've been fortunate to have several artists in residence who you will hear from before, but I'm going to tell you at least how I think about it, and whether the way I think about it has any bearing on their experiences is something we will find out. So what I've told all of them before they came is what I did not want in an artist. One, I did not want someone who's going to make pretty pictures of brains. And I did not want someone who is going to be a very sophisticated depictor of our data. Right? Neither of those are all that interesting to me. But if you go back to this idea of divergent and convergent, more exploration, and the unfortunate choice of words in the literature, it's exploration and exploitation. The idea was to lean into exploration. And so for the first 3 months, at a minimum, the idea was they would come, be in the lab, be in lab meetings, hopefully participate in social activities. And we would not talk about a project at all. As an immigrant, and for any of you that are immigrants or have lived in different countries, you know, it takes a while to get embedded in a different culture, and language is really important. You might be using the exact same words, but meaning very different things. So part of the idea was just hang out with us, ask questions as they come up, but just be embedded in the dynamics of the lab, and the kinds of questions we ask and the language we use. And after that, we might start thinking about what kind of project they would do. And ideally, some of the actual work that we're doing in the lab, the empirical results, the questions we're dealing with would open up, would serve as a trigger in a way that neither they, nor I, nor anybody in the lab knew what that final product would be, which is very different than many of us when we do science. You know, you have to write grants, and even though we all know it's ridiculous to think of what your experiment is going to show 4 years or 5 years from now, that's the game we play. Like, predictive modeling is a big notion in neuroscience. And so I wanted a situation where there is no predictive modeling. It leans in exploration. And that this brings up, talked about the P's: person, process, product. I mentioned purpose, and tried to introduce another P, which is simply play. And this whole idea that we're all so serious, and we have very, very good reasons for being serious. I don't want to minimize all of the reasons to be serious, but to have lab, at least in this context, in this narrow realm, with artists as being a vehicle to play in a way that we don't know what's going to happen with it. So that was sort of my idea. And hopefully we will hear from other artists what they think about me as a scientist, making my big claims about what art is and what artists do, and then the specific people that have been in my lab who can disabuse me of my fantasies of what this residency is. Thank you.